But for our purposes here, this brief coverage of Socrates' art of speeches, just to say his techne of logoi, which is to say his technology or his rhetoric, what I've said so far is sufficient as a segue into a deeper understanding of Aristotle's text, the Rhetoric, and more broadly for our theme here of ancient technology versus modern technology. But again, for our purposes here, all we have to make sure that we understand regarding that which fills the role of technology in Plato versus our very modern understanding of technology, which is to say applied science, is that rhetoric is crucial to philosophy as Plato's Socrates understands it, and in particular, what we can call Platonic political philosophy. And so I'll end this introductory section here on Plato on how it is that this topic of rhetoric is not some kind of secondary or adjacent teaching to the kinds of things that most people want to hurry up and get to and discuss in Plato, namely things like metaphysics or ontology or something like that. In fact, the topic of rhetoric takes us straight to the very core of those things. And just to emphasize again, what that means is that technology, at least insofar as Plato understands it, takes us directly to the heart of these things that we refer to as Plato's metaphysics or Plato's ontology. And it all comes back to the image that I've been emphasizing throughout this brief discussion of Plato concerning following the logos. And so to begin with, always remember that Plato's Socrates is not the hyper-rational logician of lexicological warfare with terms and definitions, etc. But remember, Plato's Socrates is the one who gives us the image of all political community as a cave. In other words, speech, or the logos, as the means of discovering the truth of things simply, which is to say the nature of the being of things, is extremely limited. And that means that philosophers, true philosophers, at least as Plato's Socrates would recognize them as, are extremely rare. What happens instead is that, as he says in the Republic, the polis, political community itself, is the greatest sophist. And what he means there is that it is of the nature of political community, the city itself, to simply corrupt its most able and talented youths who could otherwise become genuine philosophers. And this is to say that most people are very utilitarian. They recognize that someone has a lot of talent, and then they flatter them so that they can somehow get that talent in service of themselves. Credit for things that we begin to believe we deserve that credit simply, and we start to take offense when people we don't know, or even people that we do know, when they begin to challenge us or question us in the various claims that we make. And the easiest way to recognize this today, and certainly among the greatest problems within all of our institutions, whether they're academic or research, science, these kinds of things, is credentialism. And to put it in terms of what we've been discussing here, that's to say, credentialism is when speeches or logoi are not themselves defended by subsequent speeches to either justify or clarify them, but rather they're simply the deference to things like academic degrees or universities attended. And again, at the heart of all of this is simply the love of our own, and in particular, the love of our own opinions. And it's compounded by the very natural and everyday sense that we have of accomplishment, which itself very often walks the fine line between, on the one hand, a very healthy sense of pride, and on the other hand, a usually unhealthy sense of arrogance. That's just simply human. And it's extremely rare that people are able to catch themselves in that error and realize that they could in fact be wrong and that they could still learn from other people, regardless of who those other people are. And the way that this shows itself in the Platonic dialogues is that dialectic, which is to say discursive questioning and answering of various people's opinions in order to get them to think more deeply about their own opinions, is almost impossible. The love of our own, and in particular the love of our own opinions, is just too overwhelming for most people. And it's important to point out that this is not necessarily a bad thing, at least politically speaking, because that's the source of the strength of something like tradition. Nietzsche was correct in criticizing Socratic dialectic. In Twilight of the Idols, he flatly says, noble people don't walk around with reasons and arguments for believing what they believe. And so as a matter of honor, They simply do not tolerate people questioning those things. But that's also at the core of why it is that the virtue of a good citizen versus the virtue of man simply is emphatically not the same. The virtue of man simply, which is to say the virtue of philosophy, is to always question and question vigorously, even and especially the most sacred of all truths. You simply can't have a flourishing political community if everyone does that. And let me clarify what I mean by that, because this is another instance where ancient technology, the art of speeches, the techne of logoi, rhetoric, is very similar to modern technology as we understand it in terms of applied science. And specifically, in the same way that Gorgias claims his art of rhetoric makes any logoi wholly dependent upon only the desires, the appetite, or the will of the speaker who wields the art, so too is technology as applied science when its aims, its goals, are not questioned, but in fact are determined by nothing more than whatever our current desires and appetite or will dictates. In fact, as we'll see much further in the discussion here, Heidegger argues that the current understanding of modern technology as applied science is simply the most prominent manifestation of the will to power that one finds in Nietzsche. And insofar as technology, in the modern sense, is nothing more than will to power, Heidegger argues that modern technology as applied science is nihilism. But be that as it may, rhetoric is of necessity crucial to philosophy insofar as philosophy is public, which is to say, insofar as philosophy is political philosophy. And nothing says this more strongly than the role of the noble lies